What's up, everyone? It's Jay. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Gritty Fantasy Football Podcast. So, this is our very first episode. I know, so exciting. But I have the feeling that we're going to get a few listeners that don't really know anything about fantasy football. People like our moms. Or maybe someone will see this on my Instagram story and think, Jay's a cool guy, I'll check out his podcast. Although I might be overestimating my reach a bit. But if you're listening, whether you know anything about fantasy football or not, thanks a lot. We really appreciate you. And I would say I love you guys, but that's not really a first episode type of thing to say. That's more of a 9th or 10th episode type of thing to say. And while I'm joking here, my mom is not going to listen to this podcast. I showed her our intro episode, which is 5 minutes long, and she goes, 5 minutes? That's way too long. No one is going to want to listen to that. So I'll just ignore that feedback for now. That's enough for the cold open. Let's talk about tight ends. And if you've been doing fantasy football for multiple years, you're familiar with what the tight end landscape usually looks like. Typically, there's one super dominant guy. In the years past, that's been Travis Kelce. And below that, there'll be a few guys that are not as dominant, but are still giving you a high level of production. Now, when you go below that, that's when it starts to get bad. That's when the production gets really inconsistent and lackluster. Where if you don't have one of those top guys, you're just hoping to get at least 4 points out of your tight end if he doesn't score a touchdown. You might even remember conversations about removing the tight end position from fantasy football. This year was like that to some extent. We did have one super dominant guy, that was Trey McBride. We also did have some high performers below that, Brock Bowers, George Kittle. But the inconsistency of the tier below that didn't really exist to the same extent. So if we count the number of tight ends that have scored more than 10 points per game across the last 11 years and take that average, we find that on average there will be about 12 tight ends that score 10 or more points per game. This year we had 16. If we take that down to 9 points per game, we'll find that on average we'll have 16 tight ends that score 9 or more points per game. This year we had 19. And if we go down to 8, we find that on average we'll have 20 tight ends. This year we had 24. So we had a lot more tight ends hitting basic production metrics than we typically do. As for how those tight ends scored, at the very top end, they scored about the same as average. So our tight ends 1 through 5 scored about the same as we would expect a tight end 1 through 5 to score in any given year. But when we go to deeper tiers than that, that's really where we start to see the difference. So our tight end 12 this year scored 10.6 points per game. Our tight end 20 this year scored 8.8 points per game. Both of those marks were the highest at those levels since 2016, so almost a decade. That's a lot of numbers to say that tight end wasn't that bad this year. If you didn't have one of the top guys, you weren't necessarily struggling for the whole season. Now, talking about these different tiers of tight ends brings me to different tight end draft strategies. And there's a lot of ways you could draft tight ends. One way is to draft the elite tight end. And this is personally my favorite because it's the easiest and makes it the most stress-free for the rest of the season. If I can draft Trey McBride and just put him in my lineup and not worry about it for the rest of the season, that's awesome. Just to set it and forget it, drinking out of coconut, life sure is sweet. But from a statistical standpoint, there's a high level of predictability in this range of tight ends. Now I'm going to go over some data here that might get a little bit confusing, so I'm just going to define a few terms right here. When I'm talking about high-end tight end ones, I'm talking about tight ends that finish top 5 at the end of the season on a points per game basis. So if we look back at the end of the season and we look at the highest scoring tight ends on a points per game basis, the top 5, those are our high-end tight end ones. Our low-end tight end ones are 6 through 10. So we're tight end 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 on a point per game basis at the end of the season. Those are our low-end tight end ones. Since 2015, of all the tight ends that have finished as high-end tight end ones, 50.9% of them were drafted as top 5 tight ends by ADP. So that means when you draft a tight end in the top 5, there's a 50% chance that they're going to finish as a top 5 tight end. And if we extrapolate that further, when you draft a tight end in the top 5, there's a 78.2% chance that they're going to finish as a top 10 tight end. So you're pretty safe when you're drafting a tight end in this range. Now, if you miss out on a top 5 tight end, you might go to the next tier, which is your low-end tight end ones. So those are your tight ends 6 through 10. Since 2015, 16.4% of the tight ends that finished as high-end tight end ones were drafted in this range. And 21.8% of the tight ends that finished as low-end tight end ones were drafted in this range. And those numbers aren't too bad. But the problem comes when we look at the next tier of tight ends, the tight ends that are drafted from 11 through 15. Since 2015, of tight ends to finish as high-end tight end ones, 12.7% of them have come from the 11 through 15 range. And of the tight ends to finish as low-end tight end ones, 20% of them have come from the 11 through 15 range. So these numbers are slightly lower than those of the 6 through 10 range, but they're not that much lower. And with it not being that much lower, we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it to pay the higher cost of drafting a tight end in the 6 through 10 range if there's not a significantly higher chance of them breaking out than there is in the 11 through 15 range? Now, those are a lot of numbers I just said, so let me just make this a little bit more practical. Our tight end 6 this last year had an ADP of 69. That was TJ Hawkinson. Our tight end 11 this year had an ADP of 102. Some years it's even later than that. This year it was Tucker Kraft, who actually ended up outperforming TJ Hawkinson. But if I'm looking at TJ Hawkinson and Tucker Kraft is going a lot later, and the stats show me that TJ Hawkinson doesn't have a significantly higher chance of doing better than Tucker Kraft does, why would I not just draft Tucker Kraft later on? And that really takes us to our last tight end strategy, is the late round tight end. An interesting stat is that 14.5% of tight ends that have finished as high-end tight end ones have been drafted outside of the top 20. And that's a significant amount. That's not a negligible amount. So that's the strategy we're going to focus on for the rest of this episode. Now, late round tight end strategy could mean anything. Late rounds is subjective. To me, it just means that you're paying a low cost, that you're not drafting the player at an insanely high ADP. You can make the argument that tight end 11 is a late round pick in certain years. But with that being said, there's a lot of players in this range. And maybe 14.5% of those high-end tight end ones come from this range. But how am I supposed to know who to target? There could be 30 tight ends in this range. And the key to answering that is to ask us why players are being drafted in this low range in the first place. So from this past year, here's an example of some of the tight ends that were drafted near that tight end 20 range. Jonnu Smith, Hunter Henry, Zach Ertz, Isaiah Likely. And with each of these players, we could ask ourselves, why are they being drafted in this range? Let's start with Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry actually ended up doing good this year. He finished as a tight end 9, so if you drafted him, that might have worked out for you. But entering that draft, Hunter Henry had given us 10 years in the NFL and had never finished higher than tight end 9. So we kind of know what his ceiling is. We know he's not going to beat that ceiling. But also, we have a large sample size of what Hunter Henry has given us in his career. And it hasn't been anything too meaningful, anything too crazy, anything really worth chasing after. Then we go into Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz we know is at the end of his career. We know his ceiling is capped. We know he's not going to be giving us anything special. That's why he's getting pushed to the tight end 20 range. And Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith was coming off of a great year. But also in his 9 years in the NFL, he had only finished as a top 10 tight end once. That would lead us to think that 1 year that he was good was the exception, not the pattern. We can't expect him to be that good again. In fact, we should be expecting him to not be that good again. That's why he's getting pushed down to that range. Now there's another player that was drafted in this range, Brenton Strange. But what was the reason that Brenton Strange was drafted around here? And it was because we didn't know if he was good. We didn't know if he was bad, but we also didn't know if he was good. And that's different than these other guys. Because those other guys, we know what they're giving us. We know what to expect from them. But with Brenton Strange, we didn't know what to expect. And that alone gives us the possibility that he could break out, that he could be a valuable pick. Now if we look at Brenton Strange a little bit closer, the reason why we can't be confident that he's good is he's never given us those elite numbers as a tight end. We've never gotten Trey McBride numbers from Brenton Strange. But when you look at his snap counts, you can't really blame him because he hasn't played that much. In his second year, Brenton Strange played 2 games where he had 80% or more of snaps. In all the other games, he had less snaps than that. And in those 2 games, he had 10 plus PPR points in both of them. So in those 2 games where he played a lot of snaps, he was productive. And that's kind of the thing with all second and third year players that haven't broken out yet. We can't know for sure that they aren't good. And we can't know for sure that they're going to be bad. And that alone inherently gives us a little bit of upside. That they could get more opportunity and they could prove themselves. So that's why when we're looking at late round tight ends, we should be looking at younger players. Guys that haven't had a chance to prove themselves. Because the reason they're getting drafted so late, unlike the guys around them, isn't that we know that they're bad. It's because we don't know yet if they're good. Another thing to look for when we're looking at late round tight ends is that we want production. Previous production is the biggest predictor of future production. If I was to ask you right now in 2026, is Trey McBride good? Is he a good fantasy tight end? You would say yes. And your reasoning would be because he just scored 300 fantasy points. He just outscored the tight end 2 by over 100 points. We know he's good because he's shown us that he can score points. And because of that, he's going to be drafted highly next year because we're going to be expecting him to score a lot of points again. So when we're trying to find a player that could break out, we want some sort of indication that they're capable of breaking out, that they've produced in the past, and that they could produce again in the future. Now, when you're a second and third year player, there's a high chance that you haven't had that opportunity to produce. That's what we just talked about. But even so, we need to see something. You can't score 0 points your first year and 0 points your second year and expect us to think that you're going to take a big leap going forward. So we have to see something, even if it's not a lot. And the way that I define production for this data is that they have 3 or more games scoring 10 plus PPR points in the year before. And that's not a high bar to clear. You could realistically score 3 touchdowns in the season and end up with 3 games scoring 10 plus PPR points. And that's kind of the point, that it's a low enough threshold that you should be able to hit it if you're a good enough player, but it's not high enough where you won't be able to hit it if you don't have the opportunity. Now, if you look at the following criteria, second and third year players that had 3 or more games scoring 10 plus PPR points in their prior season, that went on to play a game in their next season, and were drafted outside of the top 5 by ADP. There's 48 players that have done that since 2015. Of those 48, 23 have exceeded their expected points per game by ADP. And what that means is that if a player is drafted as the tight end 22, and we look at the average amount of points that the tight end 22 has scored across the last 11 years, that would be their expected points per game. Of the 48, 23 have exceeded their expected points per game. And that's 48%. That's a significant amount. And what this is saying is that when a player is young, and they've shown us that they've had some production in the past, that's generally an indication that they're going to be of value at where they're drafted. Now, there's another factor to consider here. This whole concept of drafting younger players is based on the idea that they haven't had a chance to prove themselves yet. Now, in order to have a chance to prove themselves, they need to see an increase in snaps. And that's a big factor here. We can't reasonably project a player to break out if we can't also project them to have an increase in snaps. Now, of the set of players that I just mentioned that met those specific criteria, second or third year player, 3 or more games scoring 10 plus PPR points, 26 of them saw an increase in passing snaps per game. So that's from PFF, and that's the snaps lined up on the field on passing plays. Of those 26 that saw an increase in snaps, 16 of them exceeded their expected points by ADP. So that's 61.5% of them have exceeded their expected points by ADP. That's a significant amount. And that's not just saying that because they played more snaps, they scored more points. That's kind of obvious. That's kind of straightforward that that's what would happen. Of these 26 players that played more snaps, 25 of them also saw an increase in their points per game. That's not really surprising here. But to exceed their expected points by ADP means that they're of value at their pick. They're outperforming what you're drafted them for. When you draft someone as the tight end 20, you don't want them to finish as the tight end 20. You want them to finish higher than that. And that's what these players are doing. 61.5% of the time, they're outperforming that. And none of this should be overly surprising. When we take a player that might be good, that's what the production criteria is, and they're a young player that hasn't had a lot of opportunity, and we project them to have an increase in snaps, realistically, they should have an increase in productivity. It's not a complicated concept, but it's something that a lot of people will overlook. Because then when you're in this draft range and you're picking between guys like Jonnu Smith, Zach Ertz, and Brenton Strange, they won't think to draft Brenton Strange, even though he's the one that's in the situation, and none of the other guys are. Let's go back to Brenton Strange. Brenton Strange was a particular target of mine for last year's draft, and these were just the things I saw with him. In his second year, he was productive on his limited opportunity. When he was given some amount of opportunity, he was productive with that. And what that indicates to us is that if he's given more opportunity, he's going to be productive with that too. Another thing is that he was a talented player. He was a second-round pick in the NFL draft, and for a team to use a pick that high on him, especially as a tight end, is some indicator that he's good and a part of the team's plans. And the big thing here, the main thing that made me target Brenton Strange, was that Evan Ingram left the offense. He was no longer taking all those targets away, and because of that, Brenton Strange could step into that role. And with him, we saw a young, talented player that was productive on limited snaps and that we could reasonably project an increase in volume for. And that's why he should be a target over guys like Zach Ertz, where you can't say the same thing for him. Another example of this is Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft, his rookie year, didn't play a lot of snaps until the very end of the season. And when he did get those snaps, he was productive. He had 3 or more games scoring 10 plus PPR points, like that criteria we were talking about. And even though he did that, going into the next season, he was drafted as the tight end 74. So no one was drafting Tucker Kraft. And that's fine. But if you knew that he was productive as a rookie, and there was a chance he could play more, you could keep an eye on him. You could put him on your watch list, and when you see him have 1 or 2 good games, that's when you pick him up. And he ended up being pretty good that year. And then he took another step going into this year. So Tucker Kraft is someone who definitely fits this system. Now, this criteria I gave to define production which is 3 or more games scoring 10 plus PPR points, was just so I could have some stats for this. Production is really subjective. You can look at a player's game log and figure out if that player was productive or not. It's really up to you to decide. Like Trey McBride does not fit this criteria, but if I look at his rookie year, I can make the argument that he was productive. And that would mean that he's worth taking a chance on, or maybe keeping an eye on. Now, with all that being said, you might be thinking, what does that mean for this year? So here's just a list of players that met that criteria. Second and third year players this year, and last season they had 3 or more games scoring 10 plus PPR points. Brock Bowers, Harold Fannin Jr., Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland. Those are the big 4, you're probably aware of them already. Then below that, Oronde Gadsden, Gunnar Helm, Mason Taylor, Terrence Ferguson, AJ Barner, and Theo Johnson. And of that group, Mason Taylor and Terrence Ferguson played the least amount of snaps. They have the most amount of room to grow in snaps. So those might be guys that you want to keep a closer eye on. It's still too early to tell with this and how ADP is going to shake out, so there might need to be a follow-up episode to this later in the summer. Gunnar Helm is an example of someone that we want to keep an eye on for opportunity, because right now he's in an offense with Chig Okonkwo, and if Okonkwo doesn't leave the offense, can we reasonably project an increase in volume for Gunnar Helm? Probably not, and then we wouldn't be targeting him anymore. Anyways, that was a lot of information, but just to wrap things up, you can draft whoever you want. You can draft any player in any range. If you think a player is going to be good, by all means, draft them. But if you find yourself in a situation where Trey McBride is off the board, now Brock Bowers and George Kittle are gone, and you're panicking, who's my tight end going to be? And you find yourself reaching for TJ Hawkinson in the 7th round, take a step back and ask yourself these 3 questions. Is drafting this player here worth the higher cost as opposed to drafting another player later on? Why is this player being drafted at this range and not higher up? Is this player being drafted here because we know he's not good or that he's average, or just that we don't know that he's good yet? That's all I have to say for now. I'm going to gritty on out of here, and I hope you have a gritty-tastic rest of your day.